Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this distinct expectation of precision. Like, you go into a clinic, you break your arm, the x-ray shows that jagged white line on the black film, and the doctor just points to it.
Right, it's entirely binary.
Exactly. The pathology is contained. I mean, it's visible.
Yeah, the bone is either fractured or it possesses its structural integrity. And we have a profound societal comfort with that level of empirical visibility. We are so conditioned to seek out categories that don't require us to interpret, but merely to observe.
But the moment you step outside the realm of the physical, right, and you step into the architecture of human meaning, those deep existential questions of purpose and identity, that empirical machinery just completely falls apart.
Oh, it shatters.
Yeah, you are suddenly navigating this landscape of personal truth that just refuses to be quantified. It's murky, it's highly subjective, and there's absolutely no diagnostic imaging for, like, a crisis of meaning.
No, the search for human meaning is the ultimate diagnostic muddy water. I mean, you can't put a sense of lost purpose on a slide under a microscope.
Right.
Yet, despite the lack of empirical tools for this specific problem, modern society is obsessively trying to run searches for it anyway.
Yeah.
We are treating the existential void as if it were an information deficit.
Which brings us to the core mission of today's deep dive. We are taking a highly targeted look at a text by Jamie Thornberry, and it's titled, "Who is Jesus? A Love Life Light Reading of the World's Most Searched Question." And I need to set an incredibly firm boundary before we unpack a single sentence of this material for you.
It's definitely.
We are not here to endorse theological viewpoints, like, at all. We are not evaluating religious claims to determine if they're, factually supreme, and we are certainly not taking sides in any spiritual debate. Our objective today is entirely analytical.
We're looking at the mechanics of the argument.
Exactly. We are looking at Thornberry's text as a philosophical framework, specifically this love, life, and light dimension, to understand how it attempts to reorganize the very nature of how humans search for personal meaning.
And the value of this text for our analysis really lies in its premise regarding human psychology and sociology. Thornberry is looking at search engine behavior, global curiosity, historical tension, and attempting to map the anatomy of a specific question. So we're going to examine the structural logic of that map.
And the inciting incident for Thornberry's entire framework is this fascinating piece of global data. When you aggregate the search queries of the entire human population, cutting across, cultural boundaries, economic disparities, differing political realities, the most searched spiritual query on the internet is not some broad philosophical inquiry.
Right, it's not what you'd expect.
No, it's not what is the meaning of life, or does a higher power exist? The dominant query, rising above all the sweeping existential mysteries in just millions of iterations, is specifically, who is Jesus?
Yeah, and the logic of our modern hyper-secularized age would suggest that the most common questions would be abstract, right?
Yeah, you'd think so.
You'd expect people to search for concepts like truth or ethics or the afterlife. But Thornberry argues that the dominance of this highly specific, name-based search is not, it's not just an algorithmic anomaly.
Right.
The text posits that when an individual, whether they're a staunch skeptic, an academic historian, or just someone experiencing a late-night crisis of direction, when they type this name into a search bar, they are not actually seeking historical trivia. The argument is that this query represents a profound, almost desperate hunger for definition at the absolute center of reality.
The premise is that the searcher thinks they're asking for, like, a Wikipedia summary, but the underlying psychology is reaching for something far more foundational. So over the course of this deep dive, we are going to extract the mechanisms of this framework. We'll look at how the text defines the difference between informational data and ontological reality.
Which is a crucial distinction.
Super crucial. Then we will synthesize Thornberry's three dimensions, the love, life, and light, to see how they function as a lens for modern existence. And, because theory without application is basically useless, we will pull out the text's restructuring statements to provide you with concrete, actionable steps for applying these concepts to the friction of your daily decision-making.
It's going to get very practical.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the starting point for all of this requires a complete redefinition of the question itself, right?
Yeah, Thornberry calls this the question beneath the question. And the text makes a really sharp dividing line between two different modes of inquiry, the informational and the ontological. To understand why this specific search query behaves differently than, say, looking up the biography of Aristotle or Napoleon, we have to unpack what happens when an inquiry shifts from seeking data to seeking being.
Right, but wait, ontology is a heavy word for someone just Googling a historical name. Like, let's isolate that word. For someone listening right now while commuting or walking their dog, ontology is not a word that naturally enters the daily vocabulary.
No, definitely not.
If I type a historical name into my phone, I'm not consciously thinking, ah, yes, I am now conducting a rigorous ontological inquiry. I mean, I just want to know what year the Roman Empire fell or who painted the Sistine Chapel.
What's fascinating here is that the conscious vocabulary is entirely irrelevant to the underlying psychological mechanism.
Okay, how so?
Well, an informational quotient is safe. It's a transaction. You ask for a data point, the capital of France, the atomic weight of carbon, and the search engine delivers it. You take that data, you store it in your mental filing cabinet, and your reality remains completely undisturbed.
Right, learning the capital of France doesn't change who I am.
Exactly. The acquisition of information rarely demands a change in the person acquiring it. Ontology, however, is the philosophical study of being. It asks about the fundamental nature of existence itself. So Thornberry asserts that who was this figure, historically, is merely the linguistic surface. The silent ontological question vibrating underneath those words is actually, what is the shape of reality if the claims surrounding this figure are taken seriously?
Okay, I want to ground this distinction between information and ontology because the text argues that confusing the two is a primary source of modern anxiety. So consider the process of looking for a place to live.
Well, that's a good analogy.
Right. An informational search is like scrolling through real estate listings. You're looking at the square footage, the property taxes, the year the roof was last replaced. It's objective data.
Sheer data.
You can evaluate 100 houses a day with complete emotional detachment because none of that data makes a demand on your life. But an ontological search is the moment you stand in the physical doorway of one specific house and ask, is this my home?
Yes.
If I anchor my life to these four walls, how will the trajectory of my family change? What will the mornings feel like in this kitchen? How does my entire existence reorganize itself if I commit to inhabiting this space?
That distinction perfectly captures Thornberry's argument. In the real estate scenario, the square footage is informational, but the concept of home is ontological.
Right.
And the text is pointing out that modern society is currently drowning in an informational surplus. I mean, we have supercomputers in our pockets that can resolve any factual ambiguity in milliseconds. We possess more historical, scientific, and sociological data than any previous generation in history.
It's overwhelming.
It is. Yet this surplus of information has not solved the crisis of meaning. In fact, it seems to have actually exacerbated it.
Yeah, we are trying to cure an ontological starvation by gorging on informational calories. We scroll through news feeds, we devour productivity hacks, we memorize statistics, hoping that if we just, acquire enough data points, a cohesive sense of purpose will spontaneously generate.
Which it never does.
Never. But Thornberry suggests that when people search for this specific historical figure, a purely informational answer dates of birth, geographical locations, cultural context, it always leaves the searcher unsatisfied. Giving them a historical timeline is like handing a blueprint to someone who is looking for a home. It is factually accurate, but entirely insufficient for the actual need.
And the insufficiency of facts leads directly to the text's assertion that this figure, once introduced into human thought, refuses to behave like a standard historical subject. He becomes a reference point that reorganizes the searcher's relationship to meaning itself.
Okay, so how does that reorganization actually happen?
Well, to explain the mechanics of how this occurs, Thornberry introduces the first of the three primary lenses, the love dimension. And this requires a really severe departure from how we culturally understand the concept of love.
Oh, yeah. The text is unapologetically aggressive in redefining this term. Like, in the framework of the love dimension, this figure is not presented as a philosophical idea to be pondered, or a moral doctrine to be debated, or some theological argument to be won.
Not at all.
The text describes him as a presence that calls forth recognition. It strips away the modern kind of romanticized notion of love as a sentiment, a warm affection or a chemical rush of empathy, and defines it strictly as the recognition of personhood that demands a response.
The cultural redefinition here is vital. We usually utilize the word love to describe preferences and emotional states. We love a certain genre of music, or we feel love toward a companion. It's internally generated.
Right, it's about how I feel.
Exactly. But Thornberry's use of the word is confrontational. If love is the recognition of personhood that demands a response, then the text is claiming that meaning is not an abstract puzzle you solve. It is a relational dynamic you are thrust into. The text explicitly states, he is not primarily what you think about, he is what you respond to.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because I struggle with the idea that an individual from antiquity can exert a presence that destroys my ability to remain a neutral observer.
Right, because we value objectivity so much.
Yeah. We place a massive premium on objectivity in modern thought. The ability to look at history or philosophy without personal bias is considered like the pinnacle of intellectual maturity. But Thornberry is suggesting that neutrality is functionally impossible in this specific dimension.
Yes, exactly.
Think about the physical dynamics of a room. If you are sitting alone in an empty office staring at a chair, you can analyze its ergonomics, you can appreciate its design, or you can just ignore it completely. The chair is an object. Your relationship to it is entirely neutral.
Because it makes no demands on you.
Right. But the moment another human being walks into that office, your neutrality evaporates. The mere presence of another consciousness instantly alters the atmospheric pressure of the room. You have to acknowledge them, greet them, or pointedly ignore them, and even ignoring them is a highly active relational response. You cannot maintain object neutrality in the face of a person.
That's a great way to put it. The introduction of a who shatters the neutrality of a what. That is the mechanism Thornberry is describing. The text argues that in the love dimension, the individual encounters a presence that forces them out of the spectator's seat. You are compelled to react.
And Thornberry maps out these reactions.
Yes, 4 distinct relational reactions to this presence. And examining them reveals a great deal about human behavioral psychology. The reactions are moving toward with trust, resisting with suspicion, reinterpreting to reduce tension, and rejecting to preserve autonomy.
Okay, analyzing those 4 reactions is fascinating because they bypass the intellect entirely. Let's look at the first 2, trust and suspicion. If we view reality merely as a collection of indifferent facts, trust and suspicion are useless concepts. I do not trust the process of photosynthesis, nor do I view the laws of thermodynamics with suspicion. I just, accept their operational reality.
Right, because trust and suspicion are exclusively reserved for consciousness. You only suspect an entity capable of having motives. Therefore, Thornberry argues that if an individual is resisting the historical claims of this figure with deep, visceral suspicion, if they feel defensive or guarded, that very suspicion is evidence that they are engaged in a relational dynamic.
Oh, wow.
They are not debating a fact, they are fending off a presence. The emotional weight of the suspicion proves the text's point that the inquiry has moved from the informational to the ontological.
The third reaction outlined by the text feels incredibly prevalent in modern discourse, which is reinterpreting to reduce tension. This seems to be the default setting for much of our contemporary intellectual culture, honestly.
Oh, absolutely. It is the ultimate diplomatic defense mechanism.
Right.
To reinterpret to reduce tension means the individual acknowledges the historical presence, but the absolute demand of that presence is psychologically intolerable. The cognitive dissonance is just too high, so the mind actively shrinks the figure into a manageable category. The individual concludes he was a profound moral philosopher, or he serves as a beautiful mythic archetype for human compassion.
Because a moral philosopher is safe. I can read Marcus Aurelius or Seneca, extract a nice quote about resilience, put it on my social media, and proceed with my life exactly as it was.
Exactly. No strings attached.
A philosopher offers advice that I can accept or discard based on my own utility. They do not demand a total surrender of my worldview. So by categorizing the figure as merely a teacher, the individual neuters the ontological demand. They turn a relational confrontation back into a piece of informational data.
The reduction alleviates the tension. But Thornberry's framework insists that this very act of categorization is, in itself, a relational response. It's a psychological negotiation with a presence that feels uncomfortably close. And that leads directly to the fourth reaction, rejecting to preserve autonomy. This reaction implies that secular rejection is often less about a lack of verifiable historical evidence and more about the preservation of the self.
The preservation of autonomy is perhaps the most fiercely protected value in the modern era. I mean, we are taught that the ultimate goal of human development is absolute self-sovereignty.
The right to define your own reality.
Yes. The right to define my own truth, curate my own identity, act as the sole architect of my reality. If Thornberry's love dimension is accurate, if there is a personal center to reality that demands a response, then my absolute autonomy is a delusion. I'm not the architect, I am a respondent.
Right.
So rejection, under this framework, is just a necessary protective wall to keep the sovereign self intact.
And if we synthesize this back to the listener's search for personal meaning, the implication is staggering. Think about it. We currently operate under the exhausting burden of having to invent our own meaning from scratch.
It's exhausting.
We have to construct our purpose through our careers, our personal brands, our carefully curated lifestyles. But the love dimension posits that personal meaning is not an invention, it is a recognition. It's the realization that reality has a personal center, and your purpose is defined by how you respond to the presence in the room.
Okay, so the love dimension provides a relational center, but I think it raises an immediate and critical vulnerability. If this is purely a matter of internal relational response, how does it differ from just like a psychological coping mechanism? If this presence only exists in the internal emotional landscape of the searcher, we are simply talking about a highly effective placebo.
That's a fair critique.
For this framework to have any structural integrity, this presence must have an anchor in the real physical world. It can't just be an internal feeling.
Which is the exact philosophical pivot Thornberry makes in the second lens, the life dimension. This segment of the text transitions the inquiry from the internal domain of relational psychology to the external, verifiable domain of human history. The text addresses the variation of the search query, did Jesus really exist?
Because the modern mind demands receipts. We want the empirical data, and Thornberry's text leans on the overwhelming consensus among historical scholars, including secular historians who operate completely outside any theological framework.
Oh yeah, the existence of Jesus of Nazareth as a biological historical entity in first-century Judea is not a matter of serious academic debate. He existed, he navigated the brutal socio-political realities of Roman occupation, and he engaged with the intense factions of Second Temple Judaism.
Right.
To understand that life dimension, we must understand that specific historical context. Second Temple Judaism was not a monolithic culture. It was a fractured, highly volatile environment. You had the Pharisees focusing on strict legal purity, the Sadducees managing the political compromises with Rome, the Essenes withdrawing into ascetic isolation, and the Zealots advocating for violent insurrection.
Just a powder keg.
It was a powder keg of competing ideologies concerning how to survive and find meaning under imperial domination. It's into this specific chaotic sociological matrix that this historical life emerges. But Thornberry notes that the life dimension is not merely about biological existence. It's about how this specific life triggered what the text calls an interpretive gravitational collapse.
Interpretive gravitational collapse. We really have to dismantle that phrase carefully because it is the engine of the life dimension.
Yes.
When I consider other major historical figures, they do not exert this kind of structural force. Take Julius Caesar or Alexander the Great. He reshaped the map of the ancient world. His tactical brilliance is still studied, but Alexander is safely quarantined in the past.
He's just history.
Exactly. His historical existence does not create an interpretive demand on my life today. I do not have to reconcile my personal morality or my existential purpose with the life of Alexander.
Right, because Alexander the Great is an object of historical inquiry, not an ontological center. The text is arguing that the life of this specific figure in Judea created an unparalleled density of meaning attribution. Let's examine the sheer volume of titles and interpretations that collapsed onto this single historical point: teacher, prophet, apocalyptic rebel, Messiah, Son of God, mythic symbol, divine incarnation.
Right, and to visualize this, consider how gravity functions in astrophysics, but apply it to human thought. It's not just that a lot of people had different opinions about him, it's that this one life acts as a singularity in the fabric of human history.
Like a black hole.
Yes. In a gravitational singularity, the density is so extreme that it bends the space-time around it. Everything that comes near it, light, matter, trajectory, is forced to curve in response to its mass. Thornberry is arguing that this life possesses a historical density that bends the philosophical, moral, and sociological trajectories of everything around it.
And the collapse occurs because the figure refuses to be cleanly categorized. A purely political rebel does not generate centuries of intricate metaphysical theology. A purely moral philosopher does not generate claims of bodily resurrection and divine supremacy.
Right, they contradict each other.
The varied attributions contradict each other, yet they are all pulled toward the same historical center. The text states that he refuses to collapse into neutrality. He operates as a living interpretive demand that forces every subsequent generation to calculate their philosophical position in relation to his mass.
And this explains the search engine data precisely. The query is structural to the human condition, not a passing internet trend. If a historical figure operates as a singularity of meaning, you cannot simply ignore it if you are navigating that sector of intellectual space. You have to chart your course relative to its gravity.
Exactly.
So for you, the listener, trying to construct a worldview, the life dimension forces a difficult question about the nature of time itself. Do you view human history as a flat, accidental sequence of events, just a chaotic progression of wars, inventions, and sociological shifts? Or does history possess an architecture? Are there convergent points where the abstract concepts of meaning and truth actually step into the physical dirt of human existence?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, if Thornberry's life dimension holds true, history is not a sterile museum of past events. It's an active landscape with a distinct center of gravity. Your personal meaning is inextricably linked to how you orient yourself to that historical center. However, acknowledging the gravitational pull is insufficient. We must determine the nature of the force being exerted.
Exactly. Because if I'm being pulled into this interpretive orbit, I need to know exactly what is being pulled and how it changes shape.
Right.
What is the nature of the reality I am entering? How does it actually change the mechanics of my existence? And this moves us out of the historical framework and into the deepest layer of Thornberry's tech, the light dimension. This is the transition from who was he to what does he reveal?
Yes. In the light dimension, Thornberry makes the argument that the teachings of this figure cannot be read as isolated moral aphorisms. They are not merely good advice for living a harmonious life. The text describes them as illuminations that reinterpret the human condition. He is positioned as the disclosure of truth itself in personal form.
So we need to fundamentally alter how we think about the concept of teachings. Because the modern instinct is to treat philosophical or moral teachings like software applications on a smartphone.
Oh, that's a brilliant way to frame it.
Think about it. I have my base operating system, right? My core personality, my cultural conditioning, my logic, and I download various apps to optimize it. I download the Stoicism app to help me manage stress. I download the mindfulness app to increase my focus.
Right, you're just adding tools.
Exactly. These teachings are utilities that I add to my existing framework without altering the foundation. But Thornberry is arguing that the teachings in the light dimension are not applications. They are a total operating system update, a catastrophic paradigm shift. You aren't just adding new data, you are completely restructuring how the device reads reality.
To borrow from Thomas Kuhn's philosophy of science, a paradigm shift is not adding new data to an old model. It is the destruction of the old model, because the new data requires an entirely different structural foundation. Moving from a Newtonian understanding of physics to a quantum understanding requires a complete rewiring of how you perceive reality.
Right.
The text calls these teachings restructuring statements. They don't just change what you believe, they fundamentally alter the mechanisms of how you see.
So what does this all mean for us today? This is the critical juncture where we must fulfill our promise to extract actionable mechanics from this philosophy. If these teachings are a structural rewiring of human reality, how do they actually operate in the messy, day-to-day friction of modern existence?
Well, let's isolate 3 specific restructuring statements from Thornberry's text and translate them into concrete decision-making protocols. Let us begin with the first restructuring statement, forgive endlessly. Thornberry posits that this directive redefines justice and injury. To understand how radical this is, we have to analyze the baseline human operating system regarding justice.
And from an evolutionary psychology standpoint, our baseline system for justice is entirely transactional.
Completely.
It's an internal ledger. If a colleague publicly undermines your work and damages your professional reputation, your neurological instinct is to calculate the exact weight of that injury and seek an equivalent or greater penalty. Reciprocity is how we maintain social order. The instinct for an eye is a mathematical attempt to balance the ledger of human interaction.
The transactional ledger is logical, but it chains you to the perpetrator. If you are waiting for a debt to be paid, your emotional reality is contingent upon the actions of the person who injured you.
That's true.
So, decision step 1 requires applying the forgive endlessly protocol as a new metric for justice in your daily interactions. When the injury occurs, the restructuring statement demands that you completely abandon the ledger. You don't ask, what is the appropriate penalty to restore balance? You ask, how do I unilaterally cancel this debt so that my reality is no longer dictated by this grievance?
Man, the concrete application is agonizing because it feels like a total loss of control.
It does.
Tomorrow, when you are slighted, the protocol dictates that you refuse to process the event through the lens of transactional justice. You are not minimizing the harm and you aren't endorsing the toxic behavior. But you are making a structural decision that your internal ecosystem will no longer use resentment as a currency. You are breaking the causal chain of injury and retaliation.
And it is a radical assertion of freedom.
Absolutely.
Moving to the second restructuring statement from the text, the last shall be first. Thornberry notes that this reorders value hierarchies.
And again, the biological and sociological drive for status is deeply ingrained. We navigate dominance hierarchies constantly.
Every day.
In a corporate environment, in academia, even in social groups, we are trained to identify the locus of power and orient ourselves toward it. We prioritize the individuals who possess influence, wealth, or utility. We aggressively seek to ensure we are not perceived as the last.
Which brings us to decision step 2. The restructuring statement is an absolute subversion to this biological drive. Decision step 2 is the intentional inversion of the hierarchy. If you are applying this protocol, it requires mechanical changes to your behavior in spaces of influence.
Give me an example.
Well, if you're managing a project or leading a committee, the baseline instinct is to solicit input from the most senior, confident, or connected individuals in the room. Applying the light dimension requires you to intentionally identify the individual with the least social capital, the most junior, the quietest, the most marginalized, and actively elevate their voice to the center of the deliberation.
You are intentionally overriding the human instinct for upward mobility. Practically, this means when you are determining how to allocate your limited time, instead of utilizing it to network with individuals who can advance your career, you invest it in mentoring or assisting someone from whom you can extract zero reciprocal value. You are restructuring how you assign worth to human beings, moving away from utility and toward inherent ontological value. It is professional and social sabotage, according to the modern metric of success.
Which is exactly why it reorganizes reality. It proves you are operating under a different paradigm. And this brings us to the third and perhaps most difficult restructuring statement: love your enemies. The text states this redefines moral boundaries.
Yeah, because the psychological boundary between the in-group and the out-group is the foundation of tribalism.
It is.
We reserve empathy, grace, and benefit of the doubt for our allies. For our enemies, whether they're personal antagonists or political opponents, we reserve skepticism, hostility, and dehumanization. We believe that identifying and defeating the enemy is a moral imperative.
But decision step 3 demands the dissolution of that boundary. It alters how the conflict is perceived, not merely the tactical approach to resolving it. Let's apply this to the most volatile modern context: severe political or ideological polarization. You're engaging with someone whose worldview you find not just incorrect, but actively harmful.
Right. Happens all the time online. The baseline OS dictates that you must defeat their argument, expose their ignorance, or entirely ostracize them to protect the moral purity of your in-group. Tolerance might suggest you simply ignore them. But the light dimension protocol, love your enemies, is aggressively active.
Very active.
The concrete step is that in your next interaction with this individual, you are prohibited from reducing them to a caricature of their ideology. You must actively desire their ultimate well-being. You can rigorously oppose their ideas, but you are required to maintain a relational posture that seeks their good.
Attempting to execute that protocol is neurologically exhausting. It requires an extraordinary amount of cognitive override to seek the good of an entity your brain has classified as a threat.
Totally.
Thornberry's point is that this level of moral restructuring cannot be achieved by simply trying harder within the old paradigm. It requires a completely new interpretive framework. The text posits that these teachings are the disclosure of reality's true architecture.
When you lay out these protocols, abandoning transactional justice for forgiveness, subverting evolutionary hierarchies to elevate the marginalized, and dismantling tribal boundaries to seek the good of an opponent, it becomes incredibly clear why this search query dominates. This is not a search for religious trivia. It's a desperate search for an operational framework that can sustain the crushing weight of modern existence.
It's structural, not trending.
Exactly.
Okay.
Which naturally brings the discussion to the text's synthesis of all three dimensions, leading us to segment 5, the intersection of human tensions.
Right. Thornberry pulls the lens back to look at the structural nature of the human search for meaning. The text argues that the unique dominance of this question exists because it sits exactly at the nexus of three irreducible human tensions: meaning, history, and truth.
And the text aligns these three tensions precisely with the three dimensions we just explored.
It does.
The tension of meaning aligns with the love dimension. The question of, is there a personal center to the universe that actually sees and acknowledges my existence? The tension of history aligns with the life dimension. The question of, did an event occur in the physical reality of the world that grounds this meaning, or is it all theoretical? And the tension of truth aligns with the light dimension. The question of, is there an objective clarity that can reorganize the chaos of human morality and suffering?
And most avenues of human inquiry can only resolve one or two of these tensions. The text forces us to recognize the fragmentation of modern thought.
I see the logic there, but holding all three of these pillars together seems practically impossible. Like, isn't it exhausting to hold all three tensions at once? The fragmentation exists for a reason. Let's stress test the text's assertion.
Okay, let's do it.
Consider the pursuit of empirical science. The scientific method is the greatest tool we have for resolving the tension of truth. It reorganizes our confusion about the physical universe. It also heavily grounds us in the tension of history. It maps the evolutionary timeline and the fossil record. But by its very definition, the scientific method cannot resolve the tension of meaning.
No, it can't.
It cannot provide a relational center. An equation cannot recognize your personhood. It cannot love you.
Conversely, consider the pursuit of romantic love or deep interpersonal connection. A profound relationship beautifully resolves the tension of meaning. It provides a personal center that sees and values you.
Right.
However, a personal relationship cannot resolve the global tension of history, nor can it provide a universal objective truth that reorganizes the moral architecture of the entire human species. It is deeply meaningful, but structurally limited.
So Thornberry is arguing that this specific question, who is Jesus, is the singular inquiry that claims to uniquely touch all three tensions simultaneously. It asserts a meaning that is deeply relational, a history that is empirically anchored, and a truth that provides a universal restructuring of reality. But demanding an answer to all three simultaneously requires a massive cognitive load. Is it not easier to just compartmentalize?
Yeah.
To rely on science for truth, relationships for meaning, and just accept that they don't intersect?
Compartmentalization is exactly what modern society attempts, and Thornberry suggests it's the root of our profound existential exhaustion. We're trying to navigate reality by triangulating discrete, unconnected points. To illustrate why all three are necessary, think about the mechanics of a gyroscope.
Okay.
A gyroscope maintains its stability and orientation regardless of the movement around it, but it requires specific, interconnected axes of rotation to maintain that stability. If you remove one axis, the entire mechanism loses its ability to remain upright. It destabilizes and crashes.
Right. Or visualize a three-legged stool for the listener. Oh. If you build your worldview with a solid grasp of empirical history, the facts, and a rigorous logic of truth, but you completely lack the relational meaning of the love dimension, a personal center that sees you, you have a reality that is intellectually robust but ultimately cold.
It falls over.
Exactly. The stool falls over, it's indifferent and incapable of sustaining you through profound personal suffering. The gyroscope crashes. You need all three legs for reality to hold your weight.
This raises an important question. How does the listener actually synthesize these three dimensions?
Yeah, how does that work?
Thornberry concludes the framework by outlining what the text calls a universal human intuition progression. It's a logical cascade that operates beneath the surface of our linguistic searches. The progression is essentially a deductive unspooling of the human desire for coherence.
Okay, lay out the progression for us.
If reality has a center, it must be personal.
Let's pause and unpack that first leap, because it is significant. Why must it be personal? The intuition suggests that the apex of existence cannot be lesser than the beings it produced. If humans possess consciousness, relational capacity, and an understanding of love, then the structural center of reality cannot merely be a blind, unthinking void of energy.
Right. The source must possess the capacities of the subject.
Therefore, the center must be personal. That is the intuition of the love dimension.
The progression continues. If the center is personal, it must be knowable. This is the intuition of the light dimension. A personal center that completely obscures itself, that remains silent, opaque, and indifferent to the confusion of its creation, contradicts the very nature of being personal.
Makes sense.
Personhood implies communication and revelation. Therefore, intuition demands that this personal center must communicate a truth that illuminates the human condition.
And the final step. If it is knowable, it must be encountered. This is the intuition of the life dimension. It cannot remain an abstract philosophy residing in an inaccessible spiritual realm. If the personal, knowable center of reality is to actually resolve the human tension, it must intersect with the physical world.
It has to.
It must step into the dirt, the politics, and the blood of human history where we can physically collide with its mass.
So if reality has a center, it must be personal. If it is personal, it must be knowable. If it is knowable, it must be encountered. Thornberry argues that this intuitive cascade is the exact pressure driving the millions of search queries. It's the reason the question never achieves an indifferent academic closure. It cannot be resolved and filed away because the intuition demands a continuous living orientation to that center.
Which brings us to the culmination of this massive architectural exploration of Thornberry's framework. We began by observing a society addicted to informational data, frantically searching for historical facts to cure an ontological sickness. We examine how the love dimension completely shatters the illusion of the neutral observer, redefining love as a presence that demands a deeply revealing psychological response.
Whether that's trust, suspicion, reinterpretation, or the desperate preservation of autonomy.
Right. And we move through the life dimension, conceptualizing a historical singularity, a life possessing such unparalleled interpretive density that it bends the sociological and philosophical trajectories of everything in its proximity.
Forcing every generation to calculate their position relative to its gravity.
Exactly. And we unpacked the light dimension, dismantling the idea of moral advice and replacing it with catastrophic restructuring statements. We looked at the terrifying mechanics of actually applying these protocols, dismantling the evolutionary ledger of transactional justice in favor of endless forgiveness, intentionally subverting our biological drive for status to elevate the marginalized, and overriding our tribal survival instincts to actively seek the ultimate good of our enemies.
The entire framework is a map of how the search for personal meaning moves from the acquisition of indifferent data to a collision with a relational, historical, and illuminating reality. We move from an indifferent, accidental, and opaque reality to one that is relational, convergent, and self-revealing.
As we wrap up this deep dive, the most critical takeaway is not simply understanding Thornberry's philosophy, but recognizing what your engagement with this material signifies. Regardless of where you currently stand, whether you're deeply trusting of the historical claims, approaching them with intense academic suspicion, attempting to reinterpret them into a safer philosophical category, or fiercely rejecting them to maintain your autonomy, the text argues that the very friction of your response is evidence of your ontological hunger.
Yes.
Your engagement is the proof that you are searching for that precise intersection of meaning, history, and truth to sustain your equilibrium. The act of responding is proof of our deep hunger for definition. Building purely on the source text's closing argument, we must move away from the safety of mere analysis. As you go about your day, making decisions and searching for purpose, consider the underlying pressure behind all your questions. Right. As you move forward today, as you navigate the complexities of your professional hierarchies, as you manage the interpersonal conflicts and the transactional ledgers of your relationships, pay attention to the silent mechanics of your own existential searches. Recognize when you are using an informational band-aid to treat an ontological wound.
Stop asking merely for information.
Stop asking the search engines of the world to merely provide you with the Wikipedia specifications of existence. Look past the data, confront the density of the inquiry, and ask yourself the profound, demanding ontological question that Thornberry's text presents.
Does meaning itself have a face?